All right, so this is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet, Chapter 24, Section 3, the Qing Empire. So let's recall that the Qing Empire refers to the land empire in China. And the Qing Empire is an empire in which the ruling class is Manchurian or Manchu, ruling over a majority Chinese population. So an ethnic minority, Manchurians, ruling over an ethnic majority in the Chinese. Now, for the Qing Empire, whereas when we looked at the Ottomans and the Russians, a lot of their problems were coming from the outside. In the Qing Empire, many of their issues are domestic. That is to say that there's issues more so at home than there is foreign pressure. Probably out of all the empires, the Qing initially were in the best position to resist outside influence, but because so many domestic issues weakened the Qing from within, this will allow nations like Britain, like France, like the United States to come in and really take advantage of China. One thing that kind of put pressure on the dynasty was the increase in population. The population doubled pretty much within this time period. And that put a lot of pressure on both agriculture and the environment. So certainly we would say population pressures. You could say that this was in part due to the availability of New World crops, things like potatoes, and just simply to sustain such a huge population, which before the Industrial Revolution, China was the most populous country in the world, or nation in the world, or dynasty in the world, that simply the rapid growing population and the amount of pressure that it put on things like environment led to a lot of scarcity, a lot of poverty, starvation, famine, and these were big problems. One way that it manifested itself was in the White Lotus Rebellion of 1794. Now, the Qing dynasty was successful in putting that down, but this was an anti-Manchu pro-Chinese type of rebellion. That is, the ethnic Chinese majority population, kind of sick and tired of being treated as second-class citizens, rose up in 1794. So these are the types of domestic issues that China has to deal with. Now, another issue plaguing China was its ability to control outside trade. Opium, if you're not familiar with opium, opium is an addictive drug. I think the chemical is as such in that it's the same as heroin, to give you an idea of just how addictive it was. And opium was something that was brought into China by foreign powers. So specifically the British, the Americans especially, sold opium to China. Realizing that this trade, or this drug in particular, was really destroying Chinese society, the Qing dynasty moved to ban it. And the banning of opium thus led to a conflict with those nations, especially namely Great Britain, who continued to want to sell opium in China in order to make money. So the Opium War was the war between Great Britain and the Qing Empire, we'll call it the Qing Empire, over British, maybe insistence. I don't know if insistence is with an A or an E. Insistence to continue selling opium. Right. So in other words, the British wanted to continue to sell opium in China. The Chinese tried to ban it. They did things like they dumped British opium into the water and burned it. The British pretty much cried foul and went to war. And in this war, it was really a turning point because you had Great Britain on the one hand, which was an industrial nation, The Qing Empire, on the other hand, which was not an industrial nation, and it was a rather one-sided conflict. The Chinese soldiers, or the Qing dynasty soldiers, the bannermen, recall the bannermen are the hereditary military of China. The bannermen consisted almost exclusively of Manchus. So in any given territory or province, the bannermen who were Manchus, loyal to the Qing dynasty, loyal to the Qing emperor, would kind of rule that specific province, which was majority Chinese. These bannermen got their positions by simply being born into it. Now, at this point, by the 1830s, the dual revolutions have already hit Europe. Great Britain is a country that is industrialized. It has steam engines. It's using ironclad ships in the Opium War. And the Chinese are not industrial, using ships that have sailing power still, made out of wood. And so that really kind of gives the idea of how the British were so victorious. The bannermen themselves were simply just obsolete. Same thing with weapons, right? Again, kind of think about the differences in an industrial nation that can mass produce weapons in a factory, and the Chinese who had outdated weapons, who would have to continue to either buy them from other powers or to make them by hand, which of course would be a very big problem. And simply what the British did was just sailed up and down Chinese rivers, bombarding the Chinese military and Chinese positions, and there was really no recourse. The Chinese could not simply challenge the British. And so the ending of this conflict created the Treaty of Nanking. Again, we want to say British victory in Opium War. And now this was time for Great Britain to set the proper conditions. So if we get just a kind of a quick look at our map here, we can kind of identify a little bit of what's going on. So everything in the yellow represents the Qing dynasty. So, a very, very big empire in terms of all the territories that it encapsulates, right? There's a lot of area that's being covered here. The blue and the purple are showing you the different ways. Maybe I'll go ahead and outline it in purple here. So all along the coastline here, these were all the different ways that Great Britain and outside powers pretty much bombarded and took control of a lot of Chinese cities on the outside. So what did British victory in the Opium War create? Well, more treaty ports. Recall that in previous chapters, we talked about the way that the Qing dynasty controlled European trade by only allowing Europeans to trade in specific cities. At the time, that city was Canton for the British. As a result of the Treaty of Nanking, the British demanded 5 more trading cities, which they got access to. The British also demanded that the Chinese lower tariffs. So in terms of tariffs, we're going to say low. And the reason for that is because the British wanted to continue to sell British goods in China for a low price, effectively making the Qing dynasty not able to tax them. So this was a way to flood British goods in China, right? And lastly, extraterritorial rights, which is actually a term that we talked about previously, but this was to give a different, we'll just say law code for British people in China, right? So extraterritoriality means that if there's a British person in China, he's actually not subject to Chinese laws, but he's subject to British laws. In another way, it's to say that, well, the Qing dynasty can't enforce their laws on, in this case, British citizens. Eventually, China goes to war with a lot of other outside powers, and France, Germany, Russia, a lot of these other nations gain these sort of similar rights. Meanwhile, after having lost to the British and having to sign a very embarrassing treaty that greatly diminishes the power of the Qing Empire, you add on that increased territorial losses. Territories like Kazakhstan were lost to the Russians. Territories in India were lost to the British. And areas in Vietnam were lost to the French. So looking at kind of the way that the Qing dynasty is decreasing in terms of its influence. Again, these territories out here would have been threatened by on the Russian border. A little bit even more up, you can see kind of the conflict between the Russians and the Chinese here. Down here, the French were increasing their involvement. And of course, over here in India, the British were continuing to kind of push towards this way. So the Chinese are feeling sort of pressure on all fronts. Now you add into that, right, the fact that China is losing wars to outside powers that have new and improved industrial technology. You add on top of that the deadliest civil conflict, one of the deadliest civil conflicts in really all of human history. So the Taiping Rebellion is one of the deadliest conflicts really ever, right? I mean, outside of something like World War II, you're looking at a rather deadly conflict. And the fact that it happened from 1850 to 1864, when technology was not quite on the same scale as the World Wars, anywhere between 20 to 30 million people died in the Taiping Rebellion. The Taiping Rebellion was started by Jin Kwon. He was the leader of the Taiping movement. And, he had a lot of scores to settle with the Qing government. First of all, he belonged to a minority ethnic group, Hakka. So the Hakka were a minority ethnic group, right? So add on top of some of the domestic problems like environmental degradation, famine, poverty, then add on top of that ethnic conflict, not just ethnic conflict between Chinese and Manchus, but specifically this minority ethnic group in the Hakka. And then add on top of that the influence of outside ideas. So, for example, Jin Kwon was heavily influenced by Christianity, and in fact believed that he was I believe he thought he was the brother of Jesus Christ, and wanted to establish what he called a heavenly kingdom of great peace. And so he was heavily influenced by Christianity, and in doing so, kind of put himself in a unique position where, on the one hand, he was certainly anti-Manchu, anti-Qing Empire, but on the other hand, he was also, in some cases, anti-Confucianism, which was a more traditional Chinese philosophy. So that kind of could put him at odds with various factions within China. But pretty soon, Jin Kwon and his Taiping movement got the ball rolling. It came to encompass pretty much anybody that was anti-Manchurian or anti-Qing Empire, and was successful in capturing the city of Nanking. And due to the way that these types of conflicts were fought, typically there were many sieges that led to starvation. The technology was as such so that massive offensive attacks and capturing major urban areas was rather difficult. And so one of the tactics in the Taiping Rebellion, and which is responsible for a lot of the deaths, was simply to try and just starve the other side out, siege a city, cut it off from food, cut it off from water, and let millions of people within an urban area die off from starvation. So that was sort of an added brutality to that. And again, this wages on for a very long time, and it's very difficult for Qing administrators to kind of get a hold on it. Meanwhile, outside powers are continuing to poke and prod at China. The Second Opium War is more or less fought for some similar reasons as the first, namely outside powers wanting to get some sort of economic advantage from China. But this time we're going to add not only the British, but also namely the French, which also sort of come to the table as an outside power looking to take advantage of China. Both nations are successful in defeating the Chinese once again. So another loss for the Qing dynasty. And again, more concessions that the Chinese are forced to give up as a result. So much so that the British and the French, in some cases, become kind of puppeteers to the Qing dynasty, and especially during the late years, from about 1860 till 1911, I believe, is when the Qing dynasty ends. It was pretty much an empire in name, with outside powers pulling the strings. Now, one consequence of all this conflict and all this domestic turmoil was Chinese immigration, many heading to the United States. Not just the United States, but a lot of people looked to leave. I mean, refugees were a big problem. You know, we have refugees listed right here. Many Chinese came to the United States, prompting the United States to pass what was called the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which was the first law in United States history that banned immigration based off of national origin. In this case, the Chinese were targeted, not the last immigration ban. During the later years, eventually the Taiping movement fizzled out, and the Qing Empire was able to retain control, but only with the help of outside powers, right? Both the British and the French had a vested interest in putting down the Taiping movement and letting the Qing Empire continue to rule in a very weakened state. In the later years of the Qing dynasty, it was not a golden age by any stretch of the imagination. Corruption, bankruptcy from fighting these wars, warfare itself, whether it was fighting the Taiping movement or fighting outside powers in the Opium Wars, and the problem of refugees. There's also a lot of land that was destroyed. Think about the toll that 14 years of warfare has on a country. China was war-torn. And it was in that situation, with a weak centralized power, that provincial governors really exercise, we might say provincial governors, exercise way more influence. In fact, in reality, influence, I think that's how you spell it. In reality, it was the provincial governors that really called the shots. I mean, they could even go so far as to raise their own armies and raise their own taxes. And in this very weakened state, one of these provincial governors, Zen Gofan, he actually looked to copy the U.S. in modernization. In fact, I forget exactly which province Zen Gofan was in charge of, but he sent Chinese students to American universities to learn about the technology of industrialization, learn about the technology of factories, and wanted to bring them back into China in order to build a Chinese industrial base so that it wouldn't have to rely on foreigners. Again, any sort of industrial economic venture going on in China was largely going on from outsiders. Zen Gofan died. His effort to modernize really didn't reach a large enough scale to affect the whole country, but at the very least, we could look at him as an example of, with the Qing dynasty that is largely resistant to change, we can look at him as a way of trying to modernize. In fact, the ruler during the late period of the Qing Empire was Sashi, or the Empress Dowager. Empress Dowager means the emperor, kind of like the emperor mother. And she ruled for like the last 40 or 50 years of the Qing dynasty. She was the de facto, or I don't know de facto, but she was the ruler when the emperor was still a child, and continued to rule even after. I think maybe the child emperor may have either died or been exiled or something like that. But she retained control, and really during her rule, she continued to resist reform. Right? She did work with provincial governors to make sure that the empire didn't fall apart, but resisted reform, was relatively weak, and generally considered to be a corrupt ruler with not a lot of centralized power.